I'm Raison Varner. I'm the audio director for Avowed. I joined Obsidian about 2 years ago, and I've been a composer and sound designer in video games for about 15 years. Obsidian is really well known for deep narratives, being able to employ player choice in order for them to kind of choose their own path through the adventures that they're on. And myself, I've always really been a fan of Obsidian RPGs. One of the first RPGs I ever played, I had an odd introduction to Obsidian, was an older RPG they released called Tyranny. And I got really hooked. Then I had picked up Pillars of Eternity, the 1 and 2. I had played through those. And one of my favorite aspects about Obsidian is their RPG development. And I've always wanted to work in RPGs. And being able to be part of that kind of excellence, and a studio that's growing, who was just purchased by Microsoft as well, and a studio that still feels like an indie studio. And since my whole career has been coming up in indies, Obsidian really drew me to them. All of my work, even in past titles, has always been, how do we complexify the narrative with sound and music? Sometimes we want to be on beat with the narrative, but something I often try to do with music is actually build in narratives into the music that might not even be present in the game. But the impact that they have in development of the music adds to the emotional content of the game, and it also adds a little bit more nuance. So I'll genericize my example, but let's say you're in a swamp and it's highly technical, there's a lot of high technology. Well, one of the conversations I might have with the composers is saying, let's actually score this like you're discovering dinosaurs on this weird magical planet, and there's this mysterious magical thing you're uncovering, but you don't know what it is, but there is this sort of fantasy-like magic, in the world. The composer will know that we're not literally scoring that, but having that in their head as the story that they tell in the music, while the story is slightly different that's being told in the ground, it adds an emotional complexity that starts to bring your emotional experience a little bit more to your normalized emotional experience, because we're always experiencing multiple emotions at multiple levels and different symbolic elements related to whatever our immediate context happens to be. So I try to use audio to help build that and extrapolate from the main narrative some other things. And sometimes the music runs even counter to the narrative, but I find that instead of it producing tone clashing and other narrative incongruences, I find it tends to actually deepen the emotional experience, because you can kind of collect all this together and have kind of an interesting, unique moment that becomes kind of a slice of your memory that then pulls you back to the game again and maintains this positive image of your memory of playing that game. And that's one of my large goals are with audio. So a way of complexifying the emotional space so that the end user experience is one that feels cohesive is that to give an example, you might be in some kind of safe place in a game or something like that. Maybe it's a town, maybe it's some other area of the game where there's just no combat. There may be an element of the story that's very, as far as plot goes, is very straightforward and is very obvious. But there may be some other dilemma, or let's say we're in a scenario where, related to the context of your immediate story environment, there's maybe two debating factions. And one of the things I've done in the past is I'll take that as a musical device and I'll write a melody for one and a melody for the other. They're both a little bit discordant with each other, but they both live with each other and they sound like they have some kind of relationship to one another. If it's a dynamic music system, then you may not always be able to guarantee that you're hearing one or the other. So we might work in a probabilistic manner where I make it more likely that you'll hear them, but not necessarily guaranteed. And that's often actually desirable, whereas in film or in a scene, I would want to design that very, very specifically and have that be very tailored. In games, it's more of a probability that I want a good chance that they'll hear this and that maybe they'll glom on to what's going on. Most people will not. Most people will not it won't be in the forefront of their mind that there's these two melodies and there's this device running and blah, blah, blah. But the way that you perceive it is that there's an element of the music that doesn't quite fit what's going on in the scene, but you can feel at some subtle level that it's still related. And so that subtlety introduced into the music where we might not be telling the story of the immediate scene. We might be telling a story of the fuller context around the scene. But by expanding and thinking of the music that way, it helps in little small moments to really bring home some of the emotional impact. But also, you get to actually have some of these varying emotional experiences, so we're not so on the nose about what you're experiencing. So also, it gives the user enough freedom to have their own experience, because that's their real takeaway. Oftentimes it's not, hey, have the emotion we told you to have because here's everything telling you to have this emotion. It's usually leaving enough room for them to have sort of the emotion, maybe some kind of other emotion. And that really opens up their own interpretation to be part of the media. And that, at least in my belief, that's where memory, that's where nostalgia lives. And that's where what's going to bring people back to the game. It's not going to be, oh, that musical device that he used in this chapter, blah, blah, blah. It will be something about this world just felt great being inside of it. And I can't explain it, but it just felt good. Those, at least in my belief, my approach, I believe it's stacking all those kind of moments of subtlety and these kind of symbolic reinforcements at levels that maybe aren't very obvious to any user, that's kind of what brings them in. One of the things that's interesting about developing games is that you do have this heavy probabilistic element to solve. You also, especially in Obsidian games, you have diverging narratives and diverging paths. So you're never quite sure, like, well, when I'm planning out my music, will I have to do 2 different versions? Will there be something in the game where now it's not just me scoring a scene? I have to score 3 potential scenes and then also make sure that getting from one dynamic range or one emotional tone to the other isn't a shoehorn of some kind. That's definitely a challenge. And oftentimes we have to just kind of do a pick 2 problem, whereas like you can have this, this, or this, but you can pick 2. And so, for example, we might just decide, okay, we'll lean on this and just kind of pin this in as the music, and then whatever else happens around the game, the music stays. And this is usually a compromise that we'll take for, like, maybe there's production reasons, maybe we don't have time, maybe we don't have budget, maybe there's something else that we have to save that budget for that's a bigger hit in the scene. So sometimes we compromise around those challenges of basically player choice. But other times, what I found that I've been leaning on more and more is I used to worry as a composer when I'm working dynamic music systems as making sure my parts are compatible. Compatibility was like a big kind of feature and key word involved in all the writing. When I was working on the score for Borderlands 3, we took a little bit of a different approach and started doing, well, let's actually really embrace the randomness and random options and allow the music to potentially get into non-ideal states occasionally. But if we design the system such that it's coming in and out of these frequently, then we don't have to worry too much because a user might only be saddled with a bad combination for maybe 15 seconds. And then they're out of it. And if the combat's going on, there's all this attention, splits in focus vying for the user's attention. We can usually get by and people don't even notice it because there's just so much going on. They're tracking information and the character, the actions going on, and then they're also receiving it all as an experience. So what's become a theme for me is less what's compatible, more what's assertable. And I find that that's usually how I approach situations where there's a large emotional range I want to communicate, but it's systemic music. It's not me scoring a linear scene or something along those lines. What I will do is I'll write the music, especially if it's music that has to run linearly through on a loop or something like that. I'll try to write the music so that it kind of goes through those emotional states over time. Or I'll write the music such that the way it can combine is that sometimes it's more discordant parts or other parts. And I'm able to make the music richer if I lower my tolerance a little bit and say, okay, it's okay, these aren't really compatible, but I can assert this one part over this other part and it works mostly. And as long as it works mostly, it works. And so once I've kind of relieved some of those rules that I've been putting on myself, I find that I'm getting more interesting results in the music, and I'm getting more feedback that the music feels nuanced or subtle or something along those lines. Now, sometimes I'm playing the game and I'm like, okay, I went too sad, because now as I'm playing the game, this is the other thing that when you're testing, you often have to put yourself for hours in the game to really feel out, especially if it's probability based, because I need to be in there and feel it cycling on random probabilities for at least an hour, because that's what tells me, like, oh, I just wasn't in a mode where I went too sad. But now, every time I hear this part, it's way too sad. So then I can make some adjustments, but I don't get rid of the tonal dissonance, as in like emotive tone of the content. And I find that that's been really successful for me in helping keep the game space as rich as possible and to really hold on to the novelty as long as we can, because that's one big difference with games. This is something, it also affects VO and everything, is that the repeatability of everything really starts to eat away at the nuance. And so things that are, the more locked into stone something is, and the more repeated it gets, the less emotional impact you have and the less emotional association you have with that content. And so that's always our challenge. And so that's what I try to do with the music. I mean, I also will put like 9-minute pieces in for an ambient loop so that if you're playing 30 minutes, it only looped 3 times. Usually if we have loops involved, they're usually all the same bar length. Because what happens is the way that the game API tools work is it'll say, hey, I'm at the end of this thing, now I need to switch to more clips. And if one clip hasn't transitioned but others are, then you're gonna get an overlap. And so sometimes I'll do that on purpose. So there's a lot of things like, in maybe a more traditional music cue, whatever that is, but maybe in a more normal, a non-interactive musical cue, you need to actually hit that bass drum on the downbeat. And the downbeat of the first beat, you're gonna go boom, okay, here starts the cue. Well, oftentimes in dynamic music, instead, I'm gonna put that boom at the end. And it's gonna be just a blank, naked boom at the end while other just reverb tails are going out. But in the context of a system that's always doing this rotation of clips, that guarantees that boom is always on the downbeat of the next clip, but it doesn't have to be part of the next clip. So when those clips start for the first time and you first enter that section of data and music, now you're not starting it every time with a boom, 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 as if it's a metronome to like cue the listener in, hey, here's the system just fired off. So there's like little distinctions you'll do like that to kind of help maintain novelty by, putting my downbeat reinforcement at the end instead of the beginning. And that tends to create a more favorable presentation in game. But I wouldn't do that in linear media necessarily.